Good evening. Can you hear me? Right. Good evening. Welcome to the Atkinson. Thank you for coming along this evening. It's lovely to see you all. I'm also going to do a quick apology for anybody who didn't make it into the talk last time round. Totally unprecedented with the turnout, and again, thank you all for coming this evening. The numbers are really impressive, so thank you very much. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. I'd like to introduce you to Paul Sherman, if you haven't met him before. Paul is from Northwest Heritage. And if you haven't seen the exhibition, I thoroughly recommend that you come and see it, because a huge part of it is thanks to Paul and his team, which is a lot of material which is local finds, and that's completely made the exhibition for us. So without further ado, I will pass over to Paul. Thank you very much.
Hiya. So we're going to talk about the Viking settlement of the Sefton coast. And whilst we're actually not any settlements existing now, because obviously they're all long gone, it's more about the legacy, what these settlements have left behind, you know, what kind of information has been left behind for us to Sorry. Is that any better?
Is that better?
To get them to turn it up a bit.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about what information has been left behind, so to tell us about what went on, 1,000+ years ago. Obviously all this has come about because of the Viking exhibition that's been on at the Atkinson. It's a touring exhibition that's been going around the country, but as Joe just said, the thing that's made this different here, unique situation, is that there's 133 extra lots being put in from the Northwest Heritage Group, many of which are local, some of which are from the regional north of England, and some from international sources as well. So that's what it's all being geared up for. Now, the key to the Viking settlements in this area is Dublin. Why? Dublin was the key. It was absolutely key during the Viking Age. It was a major settlement. It was a major trading port, and quite early on in the Viking Age, it was starting to be settled, primarily by the Norwegians. So we've got in the late 8th century, got first Viking raids on Irish coastal settlements, and the first Vikings overwintering in 840, 841. They started to build encampments so they could stay a little bit longer. So they weren't just raiding; they were actually staying over and starting to increase their hold on the area around Dublin. And then you've got in 853, you've got Olaf made himself king of Dublin, and this strengthened the Viking position within the area, enabled them to get an even bigger stronghold on the area. And then, as I said, Dublin became a major trading port, possibly the biggest slave import in Western Europe. It's hard to visualise how important slavery was then. Whilst obviously we view slavery as a abhorrent practice now, and rightly so, then it was an absolute necessity. It was just another trade. It was just one more thing that people could make money from. So slaves would be taken either captured through warfare or traded, and we know that many slaves were then actually sent eastwards and ended up in the Middle East. And in return for those slaves, large quantities of Middle Eastern silver made its way back through Western Europe, mostly through Russia and the Baltic, and then eventually back to Ireland. And then this silver became part of the Viking economy, and was generally traded for other goods. And then we've got the bottom there. Dublin was used as a base to wage raids on other parts of Britain, and also campaigns against Irish kingdoms as well. Because of its geographical location, it's more or less smack bang in the middle of Ireland, on the coast. It was a commanding place to cover the whole of the Irish Sea area. So, what changed? What happened in Dublin? Things did go wrong. What were those things that went wrong? internal conflicts. Right? There was a lot of petty squabbling between minor kings during the Viking Age, and this was no different within Dublin itself. This made it easier for Ireland to actually sort themselves out, unite against the Vikings while they were actually embroiled within internal struggles. The whole thing came to a head in 902 when the King of Leinster, so you got Merkin and Flanagan, launched a joint attack. They came from both the north and the south of Dublin, joined forces, and their combined efforts then actually drove the Vikings out of Dublin. And it's this expulsion from Dublin in 902 that started off the Viking settlement of this side of the country, the western coast. We've got the whole area from sort of North Wales right the way through the Wirral, what is now Merseyside, Lancashire and Cumbria. All those areas are directly opposite Dublin in the Irish Sea, and when the Vikings were driven out, they couldn't go east because they would be surrounded by the Irish. They would have been finished off. They were almost finished off just trying to get to the west, to get out of the country. And they just had to basically grab whatever they could and go. So how do we know what happened? Well, there's not a lot of written evidence. As you can imagine, written evidence from early medieval period is pretty scant at the best of times. We've got to rely on items such as the Annals of Ulster. There's a page from it there. What do the Annals of Ulster say about the expulsion? They record that they fled, leaving great numbers of their ships behind them, and escaped half dead across the sea. So that's leaving us in no doubt whatsoever that the Vikings, whilst portrayed as a sort of a force to be reckoned with, on this occasion they were well and truly whipped. And there's no arguing about who was on the winning side there. That they were lucky to get away with their lives. It's recorded that many of them were lost, leaving the ships behind them, leaving people behind them. We'll never know how many of them actually killed and how many managed to escape. But whilst we've got in popular belief and culture about the Vikings raiding and taking over settlements and by force, this is not one of those occasions. This is one where they were actually forcibly thrown out. They were lucky to escape with their lives, and when they turned up on this side of the Irish Sea, they were lucky to be alive. So they did not turn up on these coasts as raiders. They turned up as refugees, and that goes against the grain of what we'd like to think about Vikings nowadays and how they're portrayed in popular film and culture, etc. But unfortunately, that's the truth. They were refugees. They turned up with what they stood up in, basically. So, where did they go then? So we know from the three fragments that some of them, under the leadership of Ingemund, ended up on the Wirral, where they were granted land by the Queen of Mercia. And the number of Viking settlements, Viking place names in the Wirral backs that theory up. We know that others settled between the Ribble and the Mersey. So what other evidence have we got apart from the annals that they actually turned up here, that they settled here, and they left us with a Viking legacy? There we've got a little map there. On the left-hand side we've got Dublin, and the area in red is the area that was colonised by the Viking population during that time. And then on the map of England on the other side, all the red is areas that were settled during the Viking Age, sort of right from Cheshire in the south, right the way through Cumberland. And there were other sporadic places where there was settlement. There was little bits of North Wales, etc., just isolated bits. The reason they've turned up on our shores is, as you can see, Dublin is right. It's the shortest route. It's right across from Dublin over to the West Lancashire coast. It was the shortest place to end up. And when you've been thrown out of the place that you've been settled in for many years, you just want to get to somewhere as quick as you can. regardless of what it is. So it was a case of whatever's closest. So what is the evidence to support Viking settlements across our coast? We've got several things here. As you can see, we've got local place names, local surnames, local dialect, DNA testing of the local population, and archaeology. Some of these items have been touched by other speakers. Stephen Harding recently talked about DNA testing of the local population to find out what proportion of Viking blood we actually carry in this area, which is significant actually. So let's look at some local place names. So we've got Scandinavian place name elements in this area, in the West Lancashire, Merseyside area. And we've got some examples there. So we've got Old Norse brekka, means slope, as in Skersbrick. Bua is a farm, so we've got Crosby, Formby, etc. Car, a marsh. Olka, Hosker, Carcross. Dal, meaning valley. We've got Ainsdale and Birkdale. And obviously these are sandhill areas, so those valleys will be just like little valleys in the sandhills, they're obviously not mountainous valleys. And then we've got How, mound, we've got Beckensall from Beckens How. And then Hest from horse or stallion, as in Hesketh. We've got Leith, a hillside or slope, as in Litherland. Home, an island, homes or homewood. Kirke, church, so obviously well known here, Ormskirk and Kirby. Car, marshland. Altcar, Besker, Carcross. Cross itself, as in Crossons and Crosby. Lunt, meaning a grove or small wood. Got a place called Lunt there. And then we've got Mar Lake. Obviously around here we've got Martinmere, Jacksmere, etc. And of course Meal in this area. We've got North Meals. Meal means sandhill, and it's still a word that's in use now, as in meal, as in ground flour, ground grain. Sandhill looks very much like that, and that's where it comes from. And then we've got Mere, meaning a mire or marsh, again Martinmere. Ness, a headland or promontory sticking into the sea, as in Crossons, which was Cross Ness, the cross on the headland. And again back to Hesketh, we've got Skeeth, a racetrack. So Hesketh is a horse racetrack, Hester Skeeth. The Vikings were well known for being into many sports, and horse racing and stallion fighting were right up there in Viking Age sports. And we've got Slack, a hollow. And we've got plenty of dune slacks. Anybody that knows the Ainsdale and Birkdale nature reserves will know about dune slacks in that area. And then in Crossons we've got Slacky's Lane, which is the wet hollow going down to what was the old pool. And then we've got Skog, meaning wood. So we've got Bursko and Talsko. And then finally we've got Week, a bay or inlet, as in Blowick. Blowick was an inlet of Martinmere. A little bay on Martinmere, which was obviously at the time the largest lake in England, and a massive resource, and it would have been a very important resource in its own right, and was right up until when it was drained in the hundreds of years later. So here we've got a simplified map of the area with some of those place names on, and it just goes to show the sheer number of place names in this area that have got Scandinavian elements in them. There's actually very few that are not Scandinavian, to be honest. There are a few English ones that have survived, but generally speaking, almost all the place names in our area are of Scandinavian origin, and so that's one of the key indicators of Viking settlement on a massive scale. That they would have settled those coastal areas on the along sort of Formby, Ainsdale, Birkdale, etc. first, and then gradually it can be assumed, quite right I would say, that they started to move inland. And obviously there must have been a population here before them, so it is very unlikely, because they turned up here as refugees, it's highly unlikely that they turned up here and started battling with the local population. And looking at a lot of these place names now and where they actually are in the landscape, it is quite obvious that these people, these refugees that turned up from Ireland, they were quite content to settle on land that was very, very poor. The better land was probably already taken by the indigenous population, by the English. And so the Scandinavians from Dublin were making do with very, very poor land. I mean, you've only got to look at, places like Ainsdale and Birkdale. What are they? I mean, they're just sandhills. We know that there were sandhills then because they've got the Meals place name in them, so that they were sandhills. Well, let's face it, sandhills any day of the week is not good ground for settling on. It's going to be very poor for farming. It's poor for everything, but it's a case of making do with whatever they could get at the time. They weren't in a position to argue. They just turned up, they'd been thrown out, they had to go somewhere. So they were generally content to make do with this poorer land. And as they settled on and time moved on, they probably would have, once they've got the foot in the door, so to speak, they would have started moving east and colonising other areas, and that the place name evidence backs that up. They made a massive effect on the local place names. So we've got a few of those there that's going through. We said about the horse racetrack. Hesketh is quite a rare name, actually. I think there's only a couple of Heskeths in the country, so we're quite fortunate to have one in this area that would have been such a place. And there's been a lot of debate of where this racetrack might have been. But when you look at Hesketh now, you've got Hesketh Bank, right on the estuary, but you've got the flats on the shore, and it's quite possible that horse racing could have taken place on the sands, which is now all farmland now. It's been reclaimed, but it could well have been that all that flat land at the bottom of Hesketh Bank could well have been the area of a racetrack. We'll probably never know, but it's something to think about. And then we've got Asland. We've got the River Asland, which is also another name for the River Douglas. Douglas is actually the old Celtic name, but the Asland is what the Vikings called certainly the seaward end of the Asland, possibly from As, a small ship, and land or place. Crosslands we're going to talk about in a little bit. That's quite a special place in this story, really. From Cross and Ness, headland with a cross, and we said about Meals, the sandhills, and then we've got Birkdale, Birch Valley, Birkidal, Formby from a personal name, and Boer, so it would have been Forney's farm. So all these place names are all very descriptive. A lot of them are either personal names or they've got topographical features that they're describing exactly what was there at the time. You've got Olka there, possibly from Ulft, Swan and Carr, marshy scrubland there. And then of course we've got Martin Mere from Mertind, Lost Horse and Mere. This could possibly have arrived because whilst Martin Mere was the largest lake in England, in many parts of it was very, very shallow, and we know that. Even when it was drained, getting drained in the 1700s, it was very shallow in places, and a lot of it was more boggy land rather than a lake. There's lots of written reports stating that there was no clear cut-off between the land and the water. The land just got progressively wetter and boggier as it progressed into the lake, and it was well known that many people had lost horses there. And it's quite possible that the Lost Horse Lake name, Martin Mere, started way back, 1,000 years ago or more, because it was renowned for people losing horses in it. And horses were very expensive items. You couldn't afford to lose horses, and it would soon get a name for its place if you started to lose horses in it. And then we've got, these are not place names, but these are areas. We've got Braidland. And Braidland is the whole of the West Lancashire coastal plain, literally broad land. So all that flat coastal plain that goes across from the south of the Ribble, right the way down towards Downhall and Moss. That was all called Braidland. And then we've got Litherland. Now this is not the Litherland that's near Liverpool. This is the Litherland that's outside Ormskirk, which you might think, well, I've never heard of that. If you look on an Ordnance Survey map, though, of only, 1850, 1860, you will clearly see that there is an area outside Ormskirk called Litherland, and it's because we don't use it now, it's sort of gone out of memory and we've forgotten about it. But it is the gently sloping land outside Ormskirk was called Litherland, and it was until quite recently on the Ordnance Survey maps. And then we've got Skarderland, possibly from Skarli, which was a Viking word for hut. Or maybe, it's a bit tenuous this, Skardi, meaning damaged or lost. So it could be hut land or lost land. We'll probably never know. Names change so much in the telling, it's very, very difficult to sometimes to actually see how they've changed over the years. So what else have we got that can tell us about settlements along this coast? We know from old written sources, mostly charters of abbeys, etc., that there are around about 30 lost place names along the Sefton coast, just between Formby and Birkdale. And that's an awful lot to be lost in such a small area. The distance between Formby and Birkdale, it's only a few miles. So how come we've got 30 settlements that have disappeared? Well, let's go back a bit. Why have we actually got 30 settlements in between Formby and Birkdale when it's such poor ground? It's simply because when those people were getting thrown out of Ireland, they were setting up camp wherever they could go, and obviously Formby and Birkdale are both right on that coast. They would have been the first places that people would have landed when they came across some island, and that is probably the most likely explanation of why there were so many settlements. We know that those settlements are gone now. We don't use many of those place names that have disappeared, and it's almost certain that this loss has been caused by the encroachment of sand. Now, we all know that the prevailing winds here are sort of like southwesterly, so the sand is getting blown in from the sea, which then causes sandhills to build up. These are mobile, and we know that these settlements were probably covered over by the sea, by the sand, and some might have been inundated by the sea as well. What else have we got there? We've got, apart from being mentioned in some early charters, almost nothing is known of these. So there is very, very little. There's a small mention in a court document going back to, I think it's the 1600s, whereby somebody was being quizzed at court about Argameals, and I think it was somebody from Holsall, and he said, I've never seen Argameals, but I have heard tell of such a place, but it's time out of mind, being lost within the high sea. So people had heard of these places then, even several hundred years after the Viking Age, but nobody actually knew exactly where they were. The Argameals fragments is just a small piece of a poem that mentions the village of Argameals being covered in sand and eventually, following a violent storm, being inundated by the sea during the mid-14th century. And it appears to be during the 14th century when most of these settlements were lost. So they probably lasted from the 900s when the Scandinavians were being thrown out of Ireland, ended up over here. They probably lasted then for a few hundred years, and once those settlements were covered over by sand or lost to the sea, those people would have to move on. It probably would have been a gradual process, but we don't actually know. All we've got here with the Argameals fragments is a little bit of a glimpse of what might have happened. We'll just show you a piece from it now. Right, so this is written in Middle English, so it says, Hevein a hatful black torned, the wol hust about still was, swivelic swelling up the sea, where before semt as his glass. When matters upon the branca were lander, and longer the bunker de broster, spool as it shook, with sich intenti, or erga milas alosta. So if your Middle English is not up to much, that's saying that the heavens have turned black and dark, though all around had been very still, and then all of a sudden the sea has rose up and swelled, where before it seemed as if it was glass, very, very calm, and then fierce waters pounded the shore until the banks burst and it overflowed, and then the very bowels of the earth shook with such intensity and then all Argameles was lost. So whilst there might be a bit of poetic license in there, that shows us that obviously somebody's trying to tell us that there's possibly a tidal wave, an earthquake, or some kind of natural disaster has beset the village of Argameles. In truth, it probably wasn't as spectacular as that. It was probably a very gradual thing, whereby over a period of time, windblown sand gradually covered over the whole of the area, and people were just literally forced out of their houses and had to move further inland. And we do know from documentary evidence that several of those settlements in that area were not actually totally lost. They were actually moved and have survived to this day. So which ones are those? We know that Birkdale, Ainsdale and Formby are 3 settlements that have all been moved eastwards. Those 3 were actually built, set up on the coast, right on the coast, and as the sand encroached over them, covered them over, they've actually been lost, and then they've been moved to where they are now. And if you look at where the centres of those settlements are now, they're not on the sea. They're actually a little bit inland, all of them are. So it shows that people have made the conscious decision that when they've moved out, they've actually come a little bit further inland where it's safe, where they think that the same thing's not going to happen again, and they've actually called their new settlement by the same name as the old one. Now, we know that those 3 have been moved inland. All the others, the other 24 or whatever it was, have just gone. You know, it might well be that there were very, very small settlements. There might have only been a few people. It could have been just a handful of people there. And when they were pushed out of their houses by the sand encroaching, they might have thought, well, forget about it. We'll just go and we'll join another settlement somewhere else with friends, family, whatever. And that would have made for a smaller number of slightly larger settlements rather than large numbers of scattered settlements, which is clearly what there must have been before. So there we've just got a little bit of a glimpse, a fascinating glimpse into what happened there. This particular piece is quite interesting in the fact that it's rhyming, but it's also alliterative. You can actually see that you've got rhyming there every other line, but it's also alliterative. You've got the last line there, all Argameles are lost. There's alliteration there on all of those lines. That's a form of poetry that was very popular before rhyming became more popular. So a lot of the early poets are of that type. So what else have we got that tells us a little about the Vikings in our area? We've got local Viking legends. Now, legends are just that. They are something that's passed down, often via an oral tradition. We don't really know whether they were true or not. There might be a grain of truth in some of them. Here's a few of them that have managed to survive to this present day. A few people know talked about a great battle that took place on the banks of the River Asland between Scandinavians and somebody else, but we don't know who that somebody else was. There's been no archaeological evidence offered by anybody to actually say they found a site where this battle took place. It could be pure fiction for all we know, but legends often have something like a grain of truth in them, so there might well be a place somewhere along the Asland, the River Douglas, where a battle took place, and it's something that may, at some point in the future, turn up a lot of information. We'll have to wait and see. We've got the legend that a man called Odder, son of Grim, landed at Crosslands and founded what is now North Meals. North Meals was one of the larger settlements in this area, and it actually became now a parish in its own right, but it's certainly one of the largest areas. And the legend says that Odder actually landed at Crosslands and founded that settlement. Again, we'll never know whether that's the truth or not, but it's certainly persisted, right through to it's persisted for over 1,000 years. And then we've got the one that says that the pool that flows through Crosslands, to Crosslands I should say, from Churchdown, once called the Otter Pool, derives its name from this man, Odder, who's the son of Grim. Again, this is a bit of a contentious issue. Was it called Otter Pool from the man Odder, or was it called Otter Pool because there was otters in it? And we know that even right into the early 1900s there were otters in that pool in the area that is now Meals Hall and Botanic Gardens. There was definitely otters there. In the Botanic Garden Museum until it shut, actually, there was an otter in the taxidermy display that was shot in Meals Hall in the early 1900s. So that we know that otters lived in that area. So again, that could be from. It might be that it's got nothing to do with the man Odder whatsoever. Now, something that's a bit more tangible here is the last one, a place called the Hythe at Crosslands, which means landing place. Now, Hythe is not a Viking word; it's actually an English word. So it's been used by somebody else, by somebody who's not a settler from the Scandinavian, the Hiberno Scandinavians from Dublin, but somebody from the local area possibly. And the Hythe means the landing place. The landing place at Crosslands, the Hythe, is, if you know Crosslands, it's where the Plough roundabout is now. You actually see that there's a piece of low-lying ground which forms the junction between Preston New Road and Marine Drive. You can see it. It's just like grassland at the minute. That is the old riverbed. That is the bed of the pool that comes from Churchtown through Crosslands, and it did flow into the sea there. So it's right next to that high ground at Crosslands, which is where the original Viking village would have been, along Banks Road, if anybody knows that. Now, this is a LiDAR map of Crosslands. Now, if you're not familiar with LiDAR maps, there's a little bit that tells you about it there. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it measures the ground surface using lasers, so that it can actually measure ground heights very, very accurately. And what it's showing on the right hand side there are those lines are contours. So if we look at that red spot is the Plough roundabout. That's Marine Drive, and this here is Preston New Road. So that there is Banks Road, and you can see that there's the highest contour there. So that's the highest part of the whole area. It's actually the highest settled part in the whole of the Southport area is on Banks Road in Crosslands. And then you've got this area of high ground which then starts to slope off towards here. This is the Three Pools waterway going along the back. And then obviously down here we've got Rufford Road into Bankfield Lane down at the bottom. That's the ditch at the side of St John's Church at Crosslands. So you can see that the whole of this is a lot higher area. So this is crucial, and the landing place is just here. So let's just take away some of that clutter on that drawing, and let's just see what we've got left to make it a bit easier to understand. So here's the same map. We've just got the couple of lines thrown on there to see what's what. So there's Bankfield Lane coming to Rufford Road, Plough roundabout, Preston New Road, Water Lane, Banks Road, Coast Road. This is just a Google Earth image of the same area. Oops. If we take away a lot of those contours and we just leave the lowest one, we're left with what is the most likely sea level around Crosslands at that time. Again, the red spot is the Plough roundabout. So we can that's where the roundabout's there. This is Banks Road going up here, and we can see that the name Crosslands, as in Crossness, was truly a ness, as in a promontory, a piece of land that was stuck out into the sea. So it's actually got all that bit is sticking out into the water. Now, that little bit there, we've got a little bit of land there. That is where Crosslands pumping station is now on Banks Road, and you can see why many, many years later it was chosen as the area to which to bring the sluice, the low back drain and the Three Pools to drain into the sea when they were draining Martin Mere, because it's the lowest piece of ground, so they didn't have to actually cut through this higher ground at Crosslands, which when you're actually there now, it's very hard to perceive that, that this land is so much higher. It's only when you're actually on Banks Road and looking down the likes of Harrogate Way, Skipton Avenue, you can actually see how much the land drops down. And this is the area, this is the area of where the Viking village of Crosslands was. It was actually on Banks Road. The pool that flows from Churchtown into Crosslands and into the sea actually comes along here and then would go into the sea there. So even at low water, there would have been a channel along here at the side of that. And then we've got the bit that we know as the Hythe now, the landing place, is just at the junction between Prestonby Road there and the Coast Road there. It's just there, and that ties in very nicely with those LiDAR contours to show what probably was the high water mark during Viking times. It's a far cry from what it's like now, where the whole of this area is totally covered over. It's land covered over in housing estates. It's very difficult to actually visualise what it was like 1,000 years ago. So that just gives you a rough idea of what it could be like, the most likely explanation of what it was like. So why was Crosslands? How did it come to be? Why was it important? My theory is that because it was on the Dublin to York trade route. The Ribble Estuary is smack bang in between Dublin and York. If we were to draw a straight line across the sea from Dublin to the Ribble Estuary, so you can see it's almost directly across the Irish Sea from it. Then the black line that goes across the country to York is actually the old Roman road network that starts off at Kirkham, just north of the River Ribble, and then works over to Ribchester, to Elslack, and then it finally into York. It follows the valley up and then across. We know that there was major trade taking place between Viking and York, and many of the finds that have been found in both places show that there was trade. Items of Irish manufacture have turned up in York, and coins from York have turned up in Dublin and from further afield. So we know that there's and plus obviously, you know, Dublin and York, they were the two major kingdoms. Just remember that obviously at this time there was not one kingdom across the country. We were still in the realms of petty kings fighting it out, and things were changing, not on a daily basis, but very, very regular if they had anything to do with it. So you've got the major Viking kingdom of Dublin over in the west, and the major Viking kingdom of York, by far the largest Viking kingdom on this side, and in England anyway, over in the east. And there was obviously fairly regular and substantial trade contact between the two. Again, the red areas that are shown on England there are areas that were settled by the Vikings. Mostly we've got this from written evidence and obviously place name evidence. It's fairly safe to assume that all the settlements along the west coast of the UK, right from Galloway up on the Scottish borders there, all the way down Westmoreland, Cumberland, Lancashire, what is now Merseyside, and the Wirral, etc. All of these would have been settled from the west, from Dublin, whilst it's fairly safe to say that the settlements in the country that are on the other side, along the eastern seaboard, would have been made from the North Sea. Generally speaking, a lot of scholars believe that it was the Danes that settled more along the east coast, whilst the Norwegians and the Hiberno-Norse, the Irish Norwegians, settled the western coast of this country. But as settlements progressed, and those from the west worked eastwards into the Pennines, and those from the east worked westwards into the Pennines, eventually the whole of the north of England has become a major Viking enclave, and on the east coast, it's extended as far down as the Wash and even further. And it's because of that settlement pattern that we've got another indicator of links to the Viking past, and that's in accent and dialect. Everybody knows that the people in the north speak different to those in the south, and even now, 1100 years later, there is a marked difference in language between the north and the south, and it's because of that. In the north, we are still using words which are vestiges from Viking times, whilst in the south, their language is more from Saxon roots. And it just goes to show that despite the mobility of populations over the last 1100 years, generally speaking, we've still got the north and south divide, certainly as regards language and as well as culturally as well. Yeah. Well, so going back to the River Ribble, we've just discussed that it was on the Viking trade route between Dublin and York, and as such, it would have been a very important. It would have been, the Ribble would have been the equivalent of the M6 back in Viking times. It was a major communication route, and that, along with the Roman road network across to York, that was the only feasible way to get from Dublin to York. And it's no surprise, therefore, that when the Curedale hoard was found in 1840 by some workmen doing some repairs to the banks of the Ribble, that it turned up a major Viking silver hoard. They've got there 8,600 items, including 31 kilos of silver ingots and 7,000 Anglo-Saxon coins. It is almost unprecedented. It's one of the largest silver hoards ever found. It's got an amazing variety of material, both in jewellery and ingots and coins, many of which would have been collected through trade, and it's thought that it may have been deposited, during these uncertain times, in readiness for maybe paying mercenaries to wage a war. It's hard to say. We know that it was deposited in roughly the same period, only a couple of years later, that from when the Vikings were thrown out of Dublin. It was around about 905, going off the coin evidence. But it shows that with such a major silver hoard being deposited in the Ribble estuary, the Ribble was obviously a very, very important place and means of communication in this, not just in the Irish Sea, but probably in Western Europe as well. So Curedale was not chosen by chance to deposit this hoard. It was done because whoever put it there, whichever group of men put it there, they were probably using that on a regular basis, and at some point they were hoping to come back, and obviously they never did. So we'll look at some significant places here. I mean, we talked about Crossons. What makes Crossons significant? My theory is that Crossons was highly significant during the Viking Age, more so than probably anywhere else along this coast. Why? Well, because it's at the mouth of the Ribble estuary on the Dublin to York trade route, as we just said. And as we saw from the LiDAR before, it's on the high ground. It's an easily recognised landmark. And if it did have a cross, as it says in its name, placed on that headland, then it would have been instantly recognisable. Crossons is the highest place in the Southport area. With a cross on top of that, it would have been very easy for somebody who was seaborne coming into the Ribble estuary to pick that out as a landmark, and it would be instantly recognisable. We know from the fact that the pool that flows through Crossons and into the sea there, that it would have provided safe anchorage. It's actually sheltered there because there was back then a bay between the promontory of Crossons and what is now Churchtown, with that pool coming through the middle of it. So it would have been a sheltered, safe anchorage in readiness for the tide to sail upstream. So why is that significant? Why would they need us to anchor there? Why couldn't they just go straight upstream on the way towards Preston and get onto the Roman road and off to York? A lot of people discuss this and they've not been able to come up with it. My answer to that, my theory is, it's simply to do with the tides. In the Ribble Estuary, we've probably got the third highest tidal range in the country. It's got a tremendous tidal flow. It's a very strong current. And we've actually proved by experiment, and I've actually done this so I know, that when you get out there, you just cannot go against that tide. Anybody in a sailing craft or rowing, you can't do it. If that tide is going out, you go out with it. There's nothing you can do, even with a strong wind, you just cannot get past it. So my theory is that when these sailors were actually coming in and using the Ribble as that major means of communication to get across to York, that they would have actually anchored at Crossons and then waited for an incoming tide to take them upstream to get to the Roman roads at Preston, and then they would have to offload there, and then they would be obviously either on foot or on horseback to get themselves on the Roman road towards York. Now, the thing that backs up this theory is the fact that Crossons, on that piece of high ground again, was the location of the Manor Grange, the tithe barn, and a herberge. Now, a herberge is recorded, that's a place where travellers can stay, a sort of boarding house, if you will, and that is actually recorded in abbey charters in the 12th century. So we know that during the 1100s, there was a place set up on the high ground at Crossons, right next to the parish tithe barn and the grange, where all the grain was stored, obviously on the highest ground to keep it out of any floods, that there was a place where travellers could stay. So what I'm suggesting is the fact that there was a herberge there during the 1100s, did it start then, or was it actually a vestige? Was it already established? Was it established maybe 200 years earlier? Why? Because of the amount of traffic that was going through there. These people were coming across from Dublin into York. They had to make use of the safe anchorage. They couldn't row or sail against the tide of the Ribble when it was coming out. So depending on what time they turned up in the estuary, they would need to anchor somewhere, and a boarding house of sorts that was set up there would be the ideal place. So it's my theory that that's how it came about. And whilst we've no written evidence to back that up, it just seems strange that we should know about one during the 12th century. Why would it just set up there? It's quite likely it's simply because the sheer volume of traffic that was going through that river, up the Ribble towards Preston. And because of that place's Crossons is quite a prominent position, within the whole trade network across the Irish Sea. And then we've got Formby. Formby is in a unique position. Where is it? It's actually on the Alt, at the confluence of two major rivers. So we've got the River Ribble and the River Mersey actually meet at Formby Point, and finds that have been found within Formby village show that it's possibly not just a settlement, but it may have also been a beach market. Now, some of the research that we've been involved in very recently, we've actually found some metalwork which is actually on display now in the Atkinson upstairs, whereby metal has been getting melted down and made into other items, and some of this is possibly from the site of a beach market. An area that obviously used to be the beach, not the beach now, it's all covered over in sand and soil. But we've just got little tiny hints. Some of the coins that have been found in the areas, in this area around Formby, also hint at a possible beach market. And again, in the last 12 months, there's been a couple of finds by metal detectorists that have hinted at possible trade between this area and the Baltic. There's one piece of jewellery and a piece of fabric which are undoubtedly Baltic in origin. They're probably Finnish, and they've turned up in this area. So that's showing, you know, definite tangible links between this area and the Baltic area. Then we've got archaeology. We've got Viking-related objects in this area, not particularly common. I mean, they are not common. We've been particularly lucky, and we've managed to trace some of them that are found during Victorian times, and we've actually got a programme now where we're starting to catalogue these so that they can be recorded. It's an ongoing thing. Some of the items that are on display in the Atkinson now, they turned up literally days before the exhibition started, and we've not even had a chance to look at them yet. They've just gone in. We don't know where a lot of these settlements were. We've only got the place names, and as we said before, they've been relocated due to sand and sea inundation. Again, many settlements have long since disappeared. So that leaves us with the finds. What do we know about the finds, the archaeological finds that we've got from this area? Going back to Crosslands, there was housing estates constructed in the late 60s, early 70s. The one that's on Harrogate Way, Skipton Avenue, started in roughly 69, right the way through to the early 70s. And we know that several objects were recovered by contractors working on behalf of the builders, Crowder Barton at the time. And some of those contractors actually turned up with Viking age items, although a lot of them didn't know what they were then at the time. And we've got some finds from local farmers. Again, these were just found, they were casual finds by farmers, some of them of which had been left in somebody's loft, drawer, shed, barn, whatever, and we've managed to trace a couple of these down, and we've actually got those in the exhibition now. So it's all a little bit hit and miss. If those are the objects that are being found, what does that say? It says that there must be more that we've not found. Whether more will turn up, you never know. Then we've got North West Heritage's involvement in this whole exhibition. Obviously, we were contacted to see what additional material, especially local material, that we could add to the exhibition. As you know, the exhibition is a major touring exhibition between the British Museum and the York Museums Trust. Each venue was asked whether they could provide local or regional material to add to that. The Atkinson have been fortunate, and they've managed to really pull out all the stops and get all this extra material from local sources and regional collections, and we've done our bit there as well. We've put another 133 lots in to boost that, many of which have never been seen before. So if you've not seen the exhibition, you really should get up there and have a peep. It's open till the 7th of July. It's well worth a look. What did we do to help this exhibition along? We've contacted our colleagues, local, regional, European, research groups, public and private collections, and we also contacted every single metal detecting club that we could find in the northwest of England. And we were trying to convince metal detectorists to let us know about the finds that they've got, many of which, unfortunately, are not on the Portable Antiquities Scheme. So we're trying to do a little bit of education there and trying to get metal detectorists on site to declare what they're finding, so that these items can be recorded and then added to the historic environment record, so that we'll actually learn from these finds and we can plan things in the future. These are some of the finds that we've actually got. Here, this is one from Crosslands. So we've got a spearhead, and you can, although it's badly corroded, it's quite plain to see what it is, and we're quite lucky to have some of these finds. This is from the housing estates area. We've got some silver pennies here. These are actually of Canute, who was king from England 1016 to 1035. 2 pennies there, both minted in the eastern side of the country. But in very good order, and it's obviously showing that Viking trade working its way across here. These are interesting because these are whetstones for sharpening blades. The one at the bottom, very, very well worn. You see, it's almost to a point. It's been continually used to sharpen a knife or other edged object. The one on the top is more of a slab. What makes these interesting, at the end of the day, they're just pieces of stone. Why are they interesting? It's it's not what they are, it's what they're made of. These are made of Norwegian schist. So these have been imported from Norway. So somebody's traded these right the way from Scandinavia via wherever to end up over here. This is an eel spear, or strictly speaking, it's one half of an eel spear. There would have been another one that would have been faced opposing that, and then the little tang that's at the end, which is there, would have been embedded into a long pole, and then one on the other side, so it would have been a 6-pronged eel spear. These are found in the Martin Mere area, and obviously Martin Mere was a massive fisheries resource right the way up until it was drained in the 1700s, and so quite a few of these have been found in the area. Here we've got some fragments of silver dirhams. Dirhams were and still are silver coins used in the Middle East, and they were used in many transactions at the time and came westwards in exchange for traded goods that were going from the west towards the Middle East. A lot of these are actually from what is now Syria and Iraq, and they've managed to find their way right the way across Western Europe. And there's actually one fragment was found on just the land at the side of Bankfield Lane at Churchtown, together with the trading weight. So that's quite interesting. Here we've got a couple of knife blades, top and bottom, and in the middle is a razor, what's left of a razor. The Vikings were quite into grooming, and they, despite how they're portrayed in popular culture, they did actually look after themselves and keep themselves clean and tidy, and things like shears and nail picks, ear scoops and things like that are quite regular finds on Viking sites. Oops, let's go put one there. Now these have caused a little bit of a stir. We've got this piece of textile. This one on the top is wool, and it's got copper alloy, most likely bronze, staples punched through it and then folded over at the back. This type of decoration is almost certainly Baltic, and we've actually got a small piece that was actually found preserved in mud. The piece at the bottom is again done in a similar style. It's wool, and you've got a copper alloy. Wire is twisted round the braiding, which forms the edge of this piece of fabric. And when these were done, these would have been shiny and gold coloured, and they would have been quite fancy. But what do they tell us? Well, they tell us that obviously trade in one form or other of goods from the Baltic was taking place, possibly through Ireland, we don't know, but to this area. And this is something that's not happened before. This is something that we've got no other records of, no other written or archaeological proof of Baltic trade taking place within this area till comparatively recently. This is really interesting. You might not look it, but this is again, we've got woolen thread with wire twisted round. What is it? This is part of a type of headdress that was only used in the Baltic. It's basically a female headdress in which these items were spiralled round and round to form a cap on the head, and we've got a couple of fragments of those. It'll be interesting to get this, to get the fabric tested to see if we can find out, get any DNA out of it, which might give us an idea of where the sheep originated that gave rise to this wool. So going on to other evidence, we've got surname evidence. What surname evidence have we got to do with the Viking settlement of this area? Well, we've got patronymic surnames, so that surnames ending in son, whereby a son is named after his father. And then we've got another particular characteristic of Viking names is personal characteristics, where somebody has a surname which defines a particular trait of theirs, for instance, long, short, good, etc. So if we look at a couple of surnames. This is a map showing distribution of the surname, the patronymic surname Johnson. So somebody would have been son of John. What's the distribution in this country? And This is modern day distribution. This is going off the 1881 census. And as you can see, down the west of the country, all the areas that we know were settled by Vikings, and hey presto, the same area that was settled by Vikings in the east, all the way down from the northeast, right the way through Yorkshire, right the way down to the Wash and beyond. So it just shows that even now, hundreds and hundreds of years after the Viking Age is finished, the distribution of Viking names, it's given us that legacy. It's still predominantly in those Viking areas. Let's choose another patronymic surname. Oops. There's Harrison. Again, we've got it slightly different than Johnson, but more to the north. We've got from the border with Scotland, right the way through Westmoreland, Cumberland, North Lancashire, and then across on the east coast we've got a hotspot there in Yorkshire, and then the brown areas are areas of lesser distribution. Obviously we've got mobility, and people have been moving around for hundreds of years, but again those hotspots, those red areas with the highest concentration of names, is still on the west and on the east, the two main Viking settled areas of this country. And then we've got this one. This one is peculiar to this area. Rimmer, as a surname, does not occur almost anywhere else in the country. And even as late on as the 1881 census, where this information comes from, it's not spread that much further. It's basically it's concentrated around the Wirral, Merseyside and Lancashire. And what you can't see on this map is the actual epicentre of this hotspot. Where is it? Well, guess what? It's here. It's North Meals. Almost all of the Rimmers that are shown on the 1881 census originated from North Meals. It is the Rimmer hotspot. So, what are the origins of the surname Rimmer? Obviously we know that the patronymic ones mean simply son of somebody. So where does that one come from? These are some of the ones that have been doing the rounds for many, many years. You've got from Rim Mere, somebody who dwellers on the rim of the mere. And I've heard this since I was a kid. I can't take it myself, but that is one that has been put forward. And then we've got as from the word rhymer, mean a poet. But this is unlikely because the name Rimmer is peculiar to the West Lancashire coastline and the Wirral Peninsula, and we've got poets all over the country, so why would it just be here? And then we've got Rimmer, the man who puts rims on barrels. This is one we've heard a few times, but again, I'm not convinced. And then we've got Reamer, as in somebody who digs ditches. But we know that the Dutch drainers didn't get to the east of the country until the 1400s, which was long, long after the Viking Age. And then we've got from the Norse tribes, Grimmer, as in Ottergrimmeal, which is an old name for this area for North Meals. And then we've got Hrimmer, from Danish or Swedish, meaning to seem big. So I've heard all of those, and there's probably more as well. People believe what they want to believe as the origins of it. I have my own theory, which is this: that Rimmer actually comes from the Old Norse verb rumer. Although it's written Rima, it was pronounced Ruma, and it's a verb. It simply means to clear or make room or to escape or flee. So my theory is that these Rimmers, and there's lots of them in this area, they were the people, they were thrown out of Ireland. They had to flee for their lives. They were cleared out from wherever they were, and they ended up over here. And I think that surname describes that absolutely perfectly. It was a characteristic, it was describing what had happened to that particular family, that tribe. Nobody else has come up with that one, so remember where you heard it here first. So that's about the lot really. If you're interested in other projects that we're involved with, look us up on Facebook. It's NW Heritage on Facebook, and these are some of the other projects that we're involved with in this area. Obviously, we've had a major contribution to this exhibition at the Atkinson. We're also involved at Latham near Ormskirk, which is the excavation of the medieval castle, the former seat of the Earls of Derby, site of the famous Civil War sieges. That's a massive project that we're involved with. It's going to go on for years, that. We're involved in the Coastal Settlement Project, which is researching early Sefton and West Lancashire coastal settlements, of which the two main places we are looking at is Crosslands and Formby. We've also been involved in the recovery of the Junkers 88 bomber from Banks Marsh, which we involved with last summer, and we've got another one on the go now. And also more recently we're involved with the refurbishment of the village stocks in Churchtown, just down the road, and there's many more projects that we're taking a part in as well. So if you're interested in anything that we do, get on Facebook and have a little look. Right, that's your lot.
Right, thank you very much. It was as interesting watching it the second time as it was the first time. So thank you so much for agreeing to come back and do this for us. We really appreciate it. I'm just going to do a quick shout out because we have another Viking talk coming up next week, which is Dr. David Griffiths from the Oxford University. He's coming on the 27th of June at 1 o'clock, and he's talking about Viking raiders in the North Sea. If you haven't seen the exhibition, please come and see it. We're really proud of it. It's on Monday to Saturday, 10 till 4, and it's until the 7th of July, so time's running out, so please, if you get a minute, come and see it. And I just want to once more thank Paul for coming along and doing this talk for us, so if you'll join me in thanking him, thank you very much.